Hello everyone. Tonight we're talking about what it really meant to grow up as lunch. That's right, being human, long before we thought we ruled the planet, mostly meant being on the menu for things with sharper teeth and better night vision. From saber-toothed cats dragging children into caves like groceries, to crocodiles waiting patiently in the shallows to snatch you mid-sip, to hyenas cracking open your bones the way you might crack open a peanut. Prehistory wasn't a heroic age of hunters. It was an extended audition for who gets eaten next. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this strange corner of history, where survival meant screaming and running in equal measure. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from right now, and what time is it? I love seeing this little circle of people around the world tuning in at all hours. It feels like our own firelight watch. So, dim the lights if you can. Maybe put on a kettle, or let a fan hum in the background. Settle in. Tonight we're walking back into the tall grass, into the shadows, where survival meant not being the slowest heartbeat. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. Not the one swaddled in pastel blankets, serenaded by white noise machines and Instagram, congratulations, but the one placed on a patch of dirt in the Pleistocene, with a very real chance of being breakfast. You think modern babies are fragile. At least no leopard is pacing the maternity ward. If you'd been born 2 million years ago, your very first lullaby would have been the low growl of something with bigger teeth than your entire family combined. Other newborns today get their first toy, maybe a stuffed bear, maybe a giraffe. You would have gotten an actual bear circling the edge of the campfire, sniffing for a midnight snack. Forget baby formula, you were breastfed on adrenaline and vigilance. Your mother wasn't worried about gas or diaper rash. She was worried that if she set you down for 5 seconds to stretch her back, some opportunistic hyena would trot off with you dangling from its jaws. Cute mental picture, isn't it? Because here's the thing. You were never at the top of the food chain. Not even close. From the second your lungs filled with air, you were an appetizer in a landscape already packed with main courses. And predators knew it. Saber-toothed cats, cave lions, packs of striped hyenas the size of your nightmares. They all had a taste for the slow, the soft, and the distracted, which, unfortunately, describes infants rather perfectly. Your crib, not wooden slats painted white, but the crook of your mother's arm as she tried to keep you quiet. Every cry was like ringing the dinner bell across the savannah. Your people didn't have pacifiers. They had sheer terror as motivation to hush you before the nearest leopard decided to follow the sound. In fact, some anthropologists think that's why human infants are carried constantly, not just because of maternal love, but because setting them down anywhere was essentially the same as writing free meat on a rock in big red letters. And don't think your wider family was much help. Grandparents didn't knit sweaters. They stood guard, throwing rocks into the darkness and praying they hit something scarier than themselves. Older siblings weren't teasing you over toys. They were scanning the grass for twitching ears and glowing eyes. Childhood began under siege. You survived not because you were particularly special, but because everyone around you was too exhausted to let another baby get eaten. That's the great democratic truth of prehistory. You were alive by committee. You'd imagine that at least birth itself was safe, right? Wrong. Women often gave birth in the open, and predators were drawn to the scent of blood. Imagine your mother pushing through contractions while someone else kept a spear ready, just in case a lion decided to RSVP. That's not a sacred miracle of life. That's multitasking under duress. Your first breath might have coincided with a panicked sprint. Your first heartbeat drowned out by the sound of cracking branches as something large closed in. So when you think about being born in prehistoric times, forget cozy birth announcements and hand-knitted socks. You entered the world like contraband, hidden, hushed, and heavily monitored. You weren't just a child. You were bait. And if you survived that first night, congratulations, you'd only have to do it again. Every night, until you were old enough to carry a stick and pretend it would actually help. So, you survived being born without getting snatched up. Good for you. But don't get too smug. You were still marinating in a world where every shadow could kill you. Let me put it bluntly. Your ancestors grew up in an environment that was basically an all-you-can-eat buffet. And guess who was on the menu? Humans, not the hunters, not the kings of the savannah. Just lean, slow meat with questionable claws. Let's start with the cats. Smilodon, the saber-toothed celebrity. is usually drawn looking dramatic on museum posters, but in reality it was less majestic creature and more oversized cat with steak knives in its face. Its teeth were so long they had to open their mouths at absurd angles just to bite you, but trust me, you didn't want to be around when they did. Then you had Homotherium, the scimitar cat, which, unlike Smilodon, actually lived in open grasslands, your ancestors' backyard. Imagine playing in the dirt and realizing the huge shadow sneaking up on you isn't a cloud. It's a cat with fangs longer than your hand. And the lions. Today's lions are terrifying enough, but Ice Age lions were bigger, faster, and less concerned about being filmed by National Geographic. They weren't called cave lions because they were shy. They called caves home, which means your ancestors squatted in rental properties that already had very aggressive landlords. Many human remains in European caves show claw marks from lions who weren't in the mood to share real estate. Then there were the hyenas. Forget the chuckling scavengers you saw in cartoons. Pleistocene hyenas were enormous, bone-crushing machines. They could chew straight through femurs and didn't mind taking down live prey. Whole caches of human bones have been found in hyena dens, gnawed down like chew toys. It wasn't just the odd child or frail elder they picked off. Whole groups could get dismantled if they weren't careful. But the fun doesn't stop with mammals. Crocodiles have been around basically forever, and they weren't picky. Ancient Nile crocs were longer, meaner, and perfectly happy to snatch a thirsty hominin by the leg. In fact, fossils from Olduvai Gorge carry the unmistakable puncture marks of crocodile teeth. Imagine the daily dilemma: drink water and maybe survive dehydration, or get dragged into the river by something with a smile wider than your whole family. And let's not forget the birds. Yes, birds. Giant raptors could swoop down and pluck off small children. If you were tiny enough, you weren't even worth the effort of a lion. An eagle might just carry you off mid-scream. Evolution didn't give you wings, but it sure gave them talons. Here's the hard truth. Humans weren't special back then. They were just another calorie source in a predator's weekly diet plan. To a saber-tooth, you weren't the chosen species. You were Tuesday. That's why our ancestors learned to live in groups, build tools, and eventually set things on fire. It wasn't ambition, it was desperation. Because in a landscape filled with things that had sharper teeth, faster legs, and better night vision, the only way to survive was to become the world's most paranoid monkey with a rock. You think you're afraid of the dark now. That's nothing. For your prehistoric self, darkness wasn't a little spooky. It was the point in the day when the food chain politely reminded you of your place, somewhere between gazelle and snack-size wildebeest. When the sun dipped, you didn't tuck yourself into a mattress. You tucked yourself into pure paranoia. See, humans didn't win the lottery of night vision. Big cats, hyenas, owls, crocodiles, they all had the hardware for the graveyard shift. You had eyes that worked just fine under daylight, but turned into defective flashlights after sundown, which meant that while predators could stalk you silently, your people spent the night staring into black nothingness, convinced every rustle of grass was tomorrow's obituary. Picture it. Your ancestors huddled together in the dark, the fire not yet a guaranteed trick, every ear straining for the crunch of paws. When the hyenas laughed in the distance, it wasn't funny. It was basically a dinner reservation confirmation, and those eyes you sometimes see reflected in modern headlights. Back then, they weren't cute, they were a countdown. Anthropologists believe this nightly terror shaped human behavior. Why do you think you startle so easily at a twig snapping? Or why horror movies still use the trope of something lurking just out of sight? That's not culture, that's survival coding. Millennia of ancestors who bolted at the faintest noise lived long enough to pass on their genes. The ones who thought, it's probably nothing, were digested before breakfast, and there was no such thing as a good night's sleep. Humans developed segmented sleeping patterns, little stretches of shallow rest, punctuated by hours awake, precisely because someone had to stay alert. Imagine your prehistoric mother nudging you awake in the middle of the night. Your turn. Stare into the darkness and hope nothing blinks back. That's the original night shift, unpaid, thankless, and with the risk of being mauled. Even fire, once we mastered it, didn't offer a perfect solution. Sure, flames kept some predators at bay, but others simply circled just outside the glow, waiting for embers to die down. Sometimes, fire even attracted curious eyes, a flickering invitation to dinner. So your ancestors lived in a perpetual balancing act. To little fire, you were vulnerable. Too much fire, you advertised yourself like an open tavern. And the darkness did more than terrify. It trained us. Fear of the night taught humans to gather, to whisper stories, to build myths about glowing eyes and spirits. Every monster under the bed, every bogeyman tale, every horror flick is really just a faint echo of those long nights when the wind rustled, the fire cracked, and you sat there sweating, fully aware that the night didn't belong to you, because it never did. The night belonged to them, the hunters who could see when you couldn't, hear when you didn't, and kill before you even knew they were near. And you were just another heartbeat, hoping to last until morning. Let's be honest, if you were dropped naked into the Pleistocene, you wouldn't last an afternoon. Why? Because nature didn't equip you with much beyond anxiety and soft skin. Look at other animals. They came pre-installed with survival gear. Cats had claws, wolves had teeth, rhinos had horns. You had fingernails that barely open a pistachio. Your bite force, laughable. A hyena could crack bones like breadsticks, while you were struggling to chew raw tubers without dislocating your jaw. Your top sprinting speed, maybe 20 kilometers per hour on a good day. A lion tops 80. That's not a race, that's a comedy sketch. And don't even think about climbing trees. Sure, you might scramble up a trunk in a panic, but guess what? Leopards were already up there, waiting, and they were much better at it. And then there's your body itself. Thin skin tears easily, no protective fur coat, no insulating blubber. Drop you into a cold night and you're shivering yourself to death. Toss you under the midday sun and you're roasting like a hairless chicken. In evolutionary terms, your body screamed vulnerability. You weren't designed to dominate. You were designed to dodge. That's why early humans relied so heavily on tools. The first stoneflakes weren't invented because someone had an arts and crafts itch. They were desperation in mineral form. A rock was the closest thing to a claw you were ever going to get. And even then, it wasn't much. You could sharpen a stick into a spear, sure, but against a saber tooth that's basically bringing a butter knife to a tank fight. And here's the kicker, predators knew. They could smell it. You weren't feared. You were sized up, calculated, and categorized as edible. Fossil records show countless early human remains with predator tooth marks, crushed skulls, gnawed femurs, spines, bitten through like they were nothing. The evidence is literally written in bones. You were prey before you were predator. Even in groups, you weren't much. 10 humans with sticks could scare off 1 lion, maybe 2, but a coordinated pack of hyenas, a crocodile lurking by the riverbank. Good luck. The math wasn't in your favor. You weren't terrifying. You were persistent, noisy, and occasionally clever, which worked well enough to bluff weaker predators, but only if the wind was on your side and no one tripped. And that's where your true weapon emerged. Not your body, but your brain. Instead of claws, you had paranoia. Instead of fangs, you had the capacity to imagine what might go wrong and avoid it. But let's not glamorize this too much. Being clever wasn't a golden shield. It was just enough of a survival margin to keep you from going extinct, while everything else still thought of you as walking meat. So when you picture yourself back then, don't imagine a heroic hunter striding the plains with a spear. Imagine a fragile, slow, anxious primate clutching a rock, hoping the wind doesn't shift, and praying the predator decides you're not worth the trouble. That was the reality of your natural equipment. Not powerful, not impressive, just barely enough. If you thought adulthood was rough in prehistory, wait until you remember childhood. Or rather, try to, because statistically you wouldn't have made it past 10. Childhood in that world wasn't about finger painting and recess. It was about keeping small, keeping silent, and hoping you weren't the slowest one when something growled in the grass. The fossils don't lie. Anthropologists have dug up the bones of early hominins, tiny skulls, fragile ribs, all carrying puncture marks from big cats and hyenas. Children were simply easier. Smaller targets, slower legs, less strength to fight back. To a predator, a group of foraging families wasn't a united front. It was a buffet line, and the kids were the appetizers. Imagine your prehistoric mother. She's trying to dig up tubers or crack nuts with a rock while balancing you on her hip. Every cry you made carried across the landscape like sonar for predators. Silence wasn't just golden, it was survival. And when she set you down, well, let's just say mothers who lingered too long at the waterhole didn't always come back with the same number of children they left with. And fathers weren't exempt from worry either. Fossil records from Olduvai Gorge in South Africa show human remains in hyena dens, not just adults, but children too. Kids didn't wander off, they got dragged off. That cheerful innocence you imagine in a child's play. In the Pleistocene, it was just camouflage for vulnerability. A laugh was a signal, a stumble was a death sentence. That's why older siblings were basically unpaid bodyguards. Forget playdates, their job was to keep an eye on you so you didn't get plucked by an eagle or snatched by a leopard. Modern kids complain about babysitting. Back then, babysitting meant scanning the bushes with a rock in hand, praying nothing with sharper teeth popped out. And if something did, chances are you were both running, screaming, and praying the adults heard in time. Some of the earliest evidence of human social bonds, caretaking, carrying, feeding, is directly tied to protecting children from being eaten. If you were weak, the group carried you. If you fell, they picked you up, because one straggler could mean one less child and one more predator encouraged to come back tomorrow. That's not sentimentality, that's survival math. And don't get misty-eyed imagining that every child was mourned equally. Harsh truth, high mortality was the norm. Many didn't make it past their first years. Archaeologists estimate that in some periods, half of all children died before adulthood. Predators, disease, starvation, all played their part. Which means that, for you, as a prehistoric child, survival wasn't guaranteed. It was a lottery, and predators often held the winning ticket. So when you picture a prehistoric family gathered at night, imagine the silence. Imagine the mother clutching her child, not rocking them gently to sleep, but gripping tight, whispering into their earless skullcap, "Don't move, don't cry, don't attract the eyes that glitter out there." Childhood wasn't innocence. It was a game of hiding in plain sight, and most of the time, the house didn't win. Now, if you managed to stagger past infancy without being carried off, you faced another problem. The grass itself wanted you dead. Or more accurately, the things hiding in it did. Tall grass was less a landscape feature and more a predator's curtain call. You walked through it, never knowing if you were about to pick berries or become one. Predators didn't chase for fun back then, they stalked. A saber-tooth wasn't going to waste calories in a marathon when it could crouch, invisible, until you were one unlucky step too close. Lions perfected the art of ambush long before you had the idea of teamwork. And leopards, well, they were the stealth specialists, slipping through brush with a silence that makes horror movie villains look clumsy. Imagine yourself foraging, bent down, focused on roots, when suddenly the air shifts. You don't hear a roar, you don't even get the courtesy of a growl. It's a flash, claws, weight, hot breath, and you're down before the thought of run even crosses your mind. That's the science of ambush. Minimal warning, maximum efficiency. Archaeological sites in Africa and Europe are littered with bones bearing these stories. Human femurs with lion bite marks, skulls with punctures from saber-toothed canines. Leopards, in particular, had a taste for dragging prey up into trees. And some early hominin remains were found just like that. Skeletons lodged in branches, courtesy of a predator's pantry. If you were unlucky enough to end up in one, congratulations, you were leftovers. This wasn't occasional either. It was the rhythm of daily life. Tall grass wasn't scenery, it was roulette. Walk through it too often, and sooner or later the odds weren't in your favor. That's why early humans shifted to living in groups. More eyes meant more chance. Someone noticed the twitch of an ear or the flick of a tail before it was too late. Not perfect, but better than foraging solo. And don't think running always helped. The ambush worked because the chase ended before it even began. Predators targeted the moment of vulnerability, when you bent down, when you were distracted, when you least expected it. That instinctive shiver you feel when walking through tall grass today. That's not superstition. That's biology reminding you of a million years of ambushes that thinned the herd. So picture this. Every time you squatted to pick a tuber or gather seeds, someone else stood nearby, eyes darting nervously across the horizon. Not out of courtesy, out of necessity. Survival meant pairing harvest with paranoia, because in a world of ambush hunters, crouching wasn't an innocent act. It was a gamble, and predators always knew how to collect the debt. You probably imagine caves as cozy prehistoric Airbnbs, dry, dark, and safe from the elements. A natural fortress, except of course, for the minor detail that you were never the first tenant. Caves were prime real estate, and unfortunately, the lease was usually signed in blood. Archaeologists know this because caves are littered with bones, not just human ones, but lion, hyena, and bear bones too, and not peacefully side by side, like roommates, more like crime scenes. Cave lions weren't shy about moving in, and hyenas regularly turned caves into slaughterhouses, stockpiling carcasses the way you might hoard canned beans. Step into the wrong cave at dusk, and congratulations, you just walked into someone else's kitchen. Take the evidence from South Africa's Sterkfontein and Swartkrans caves. Hominin bones with puncture marks that match leopard canines. Leopards loved dragging kills into caves. It was their thing, their grotesque version of interior decorating. Which means some of your ancestors weren't living in caves. They were stored in them. And the bears, don't romanticize them either. Cave bears were massive, temperamental, and definitely not interested in sharing floor space with fragile bipeds. Imagine tucking your children into a corner alcove only to realize, too late, that the growl echoing behind you wasn't your stomach. Prehistoric neighbors could literally eat you. Even when caves were temporarily empty, they weren't exactly safe. Darkness hid snakes, bats, scorpions, and a smell that often signaled something much larger had just stepped out. Your people had to light fires, scatter ash, make noise, all to claim a space that never really belonged to them. And if the rightful owner returned in the night, well, good luck explaining your sublet arrangement to a 300-kilo lion. The irony is that caves also preserve some of our oldest human traces, paintings, hearths, tools, as if to remind us that creativity thrived under constant threat. Those flickering torchlit walls weren't just art, they were warning signs, rituals, desperate attempts to tame a space that resisted taming. The cave was both cradle and coffin, a shelter where survival was always on lease, and the landlord had teeth. So when you imagine yourself crawling into a cave for rest, don't think of a snug prehistoric home. Think of an unlit corridor filled with the stink of predator musk, a place where every shadow could growl, and every night was a gamble against eviction by fang. The cave wasn't safety. It was a coin toss with monsters, and you were always the smaller coin. Water, you'd think, was life. Streams for drinking, rivers for bathing, lakes for fishing. But in prehistory, water was also where the real nightmares lived, because while you were leaning over to sip a little relief, something older, hungrier, and infinitely faster was waiting just under the surface, a crocodile. Not the respectable medium-sized reptiles you see today, sunning themselves lazily on a riverbank. No, Pleistocene crocodiles were monsters. Nile crocs stretched well beyond 6 meters, with jaws strong enough to snap bone like kindling. Fossil records from Olduvai Gorge show human bones pierced by those unmistakable, conical teeth, puncture marks that don't lie. People didn't just die by thirst, they died by ambush in the shallows. And here's the thing, crocodiles don't stalk like cats. They don't roar or chase. They wait, perfectly still, just a ripple in the reeds, until you crouch down, defenseless lips to water. That's when half a ton of reptile lunges upward, dragging you into the dark. You don't even get a proper scream. 1 second you're drinking, the next, you're gone. This made every trip to the waterhole a deadly negotiation. Do you risk thirst, or risk becoming an entree? Mothers clutching children, men carrying skins for water, all of them on edge, eyes scanning the shoreline. Drinking wasn't a casual act, it was a ritual of fear. The shiver you feel today swimming in murky lakes, that's the ghost of a million years of watching relatives vanish into the reeds. And it wasn't just Africa. Fossils suggest giant crocs lurked across multiple continents, ready to snap up whatever biped wandered too close. Humans weren't hunters at the water's edge, they were bait. Think of how much of life depends on water. Then imagine every sip shadowed by the possibility of a reptilian ambush. That wasn't paranoia. That was Tuesday. And crocodiles weren't picky. Children, adults, the elderly, all fair game. They didn't care about your clan, your tool-making skills, or your dreams of inventing art. You were just meat, slightly easier to grab than an antelope, which meant your people developed a new survival tactic, paranoia at the riverbank. Edges were approached slowly, cautiously, with sticks probing first, because one wrong step didn't mean wet feet. It meant silence, bubbles, and nothing left but screams on the shore. So when you imagine yourself trudging through the heat, throat dry, spotting that glitter of water ahead, Don't picture relief. Picture your reflection staring back just long enough for a snout to break the surface. Eyes unblinking, teeth arranged like a graveyard. Water was life, yes, but it was also death, waiting patiently, jaws half open, older than gods, and infinitely hungrier. Now, let's talk about the most underrated villains of prehistory, hyenas. Forget the cartoon versions cackling in the background while lions run the show. Back then, hyenas were the show. And if you'd been there, you wouldn't have laughed. You'd have prayed, quietly, that you didn't end up in their den as leftovers. First, scale them up in your head. Pleistocene hyenas weren't your modern scavengers squabbling over scraps. They were bigger, nastier, and perfectly capable of killing humans outright. Fossil evidence in places like Jokudian China and Swartkran, South Africa, tells the story. Human bones cracked, chewed, and stored in hyena dens, often alongside the remains of other unlucky creatures. If you ended up in a hyena's pantry, congratulations, you joined the menu next to antelopes and wildebeests. Their jaws were designed for demolition. They could snap femurs like breadsticks, turning bones into splinters and marrow into a snack. Imagine being so powerful that bones were just nature's packaging, something you broke open to get to the good stuff. Humans, by contrast, were fragile parcels, skin, sinew, thin bones, barely a challenge, and hyenas didn't just hunt. They followed, stalking groups of humans, watching from the shadows, waiting for someone to fall behind. That limp, that moment you tripped, that was the dinner bell. They knew the art of patience, and they worked in packs. Even if you managed to scare one off, 3 more might be circling wide, grinning with those bone-crushing jaws. Archaeologists even debate whether many early home sites of humans were actually hyena dens misinterpreted, which is a humbling thought. Maybe your ancestors didn't choose those caves. Maybe they were dragged into them by hyenas. Your grand cultural heritage might just be someone else's doggy bag. And then there's the sound, that eerie, high-pitched laugh. Today it might sound like comedy. Back then it was horror, because laughter meant proximity, and proximity meant risk. Once you heard that cackle, you knew you were on the clock. So picture this: night falls, your clan huddles by the embers of a fire, and out there, circling, are the hyenas, waiting, testing, not reckless, but persistent, knowing eventually someone will wander, someone will falter, someone will get unlucky. And when they did, the crunch of bone was the only confirmation you'd get. In the hierarchy of terror, lions might have taken the spotlight, but hyenas were the steady background menace. They didn't roar, they didn't dazzle, they dismantled. And in a world where survival was already a gamble, hyenas made sure you never forgot that sometimes the punchline of life was your skeleton in someone else's den. Predators, you see, weren't indiscriminate. They weren't running around eating everything in sight, like some prehistoric buffet raiders. No, they were specialists, selective, coldly efficient, and the weak, the limping, the sick, the too young to run, that's who wore the invisible bullseye. If you think Darwin's survival of the fittest sounds harsh, remember, for most of human history, it was survival of whoever didn't look like an easy grab. Fossil evidence makes it painfully clear. The gnawed bones of children, the elderly, and injured hominins turn up again and again in predator dens. Big cats and hyenas weren't wasting calories on healthy adults when easier targets existed. Your grandmother with arthritic knees, to a lion, that wasn't family, that was opportunity. The toddler toddling too far from the firelight, that wasn't innocence, that was convenience. And weakness wasn't just physical. Distraction could kill you. Lean too far over the river, linger too long cracking nuts, wander off alone to relieve yourself. That's all it took. Predators didn't care about your plans, your group identity, or your hopes for tomorrow. They cared about efficiency. One moment of vulnerability, and you weren't human anymore. You were protein. It's no accident that human cooperation tightened around this grim reality. Groups began organizing not just for hunting, but for defending their most fragile members, carrying the injured, hiding the children, surrounding the weak. But it wasn't perfect. There were no guarantees. Every cry from an infant was a gamble, every stumble on uneven ground an open invitation. And don't think predators respected your family bonds. They didn't fear your grief. They weren't intimidated by your outrage. The natural order wasn't sentimental. To a hyena, a child wasn't someone's beloved future. It was 15 pounds of calories that couldn't fight back. The universe didn't coddle weakness. it punished it, which is why humans evolved with such paranoia hardwired into us. The startle reflex, the protective instinct, the way we still get nervous when someone lags behind, it's all inheritance. Millennia of watching the weakest disappear left us tuned to notice fragility like it's written in neon. Weakness wasn't pitied, it was hunted. So imagine yourself back then, watching your people march across the savannah. In the center, the children. On the edges, the stronger adults, eyes scanning, weapons in hand. And at the very back, maybe an elder, hobbling slightly, slowing the group down. Everyone feels the tension, but no one says it out loud. If something strikes tonight, it'll strike there first. That's how predators worked. They didn't gamble. They invested wisely. And so survival wasn't just strength, it was luck. The strong fell too, but the weak they fell first, often without warning. Their screams fading before the group could even react. Weakness wasn't a flaw in prehistory. It was a liability the entire food chain recognized. And predators never wasted the chance to collect. Up until now, you've been living on borrowed time, soft, slow, and easy to chew. But then came the trick that finally tilted the odds, at least a little. Fire. Not lightning strikes, not volcanic blazes, but actual, controlled flames harnessed by your people. And suddenly, for the first time in history, predators had to think twice before charging straight into your camp. But don't imagine this as a neat, cinematic victory. Man versus beast, torch held high. Predators scattering like extras in a movie. Fire was clumsy at first. Sparks nursed for hours. Embers that sputtered, smoke that stung. It wasn't a roaring inferno on demand. It was fragile. Keep it fed or lose it, and if you lost it, you were right back to being steak tartare under the stars. Still, when it worked, it worked. Big cats rarely attacked a circle of flames. Hyenas circled wider. Even crocodiles weren't keen to crawl onto a bank glowing with light and noise. The fire didn't make you stronger. It made you look dangerous. A little flickering theater of survival. Archaeological sites like Gesher, Benot Yaakov in Israel, and Wonderwork Cave in South Africa give us the evidence. Burned bones, ash layers, fire-blackened stones, dating back nearly 1 million years. That's not random brush fires. That's humans playing with flames. And once they had it, they never let it go. But here's the irony. Fire was both shield and spotlight. Yes, it scared predators, but it also drew attention. Flames and smoke were visible for miles, announcing your location to every hungry set of eyes. In trying to stay safe, you also broadcasted, "Here we are, fragile bipeds, huddled in a circle. Bring teeth if you dare." Fire was survival by intimidation, and intimidation only works if your bluff isn't called. And fire brought its own dangers. Children stumbled too close. Camps caught sparks. Entire nights spent tending embers instead of sleeping. If you've ever stared into a campfire half-dazed, trying to keep it alive, imagine doing that while predators circled just out of sight. Romantic bonfires hadn't been invented yet. This was survival pyrotechnics still. Fire gave you something priceless. Time. Time to cook, which made food safer and easier to chew. Time to sit together, swapping stories that would eventually become myth. Time to sleep, however lightly, without being immediately dragged into the darkness. The night never fully belonged to you, but for the first time, you had a seat at the table. So picture yourself there, huddled close, the flames snapping, shadows dancing on rock walls. Outside the ring, eyes gleam, teeth flash, patience wears thin, but they hesitate, just enough for you to breathe, eat, and maybe dream. Fire didn't make you invincible, it made you inconvenient. And in a world full of predators, that was the closest thing to victory you'd ever known. If fire was your first shield, the second was sitting right next to you. Other humans, not because they were kinder or more generous than predators, but because alone, you were doomed. Strength didn't come from muscle or claws, it came from numbers. The pack wasn't just for wolves, it was for you too. Early humans started clustering, and it wasn't because they loved company. It was because extra eyes meant extra warning. Extra hands meant extra rocks to throw. And extra bodies meant maybe you didn't end up being the one carried off. Think of it as prehistoric insurance. The premium was sharing food and space. The payout was not dying alone. Anthropologists call this cooperative defense. You might call it, "Please don't let me get eaten first." Groups gave you what you lacked individually: vigilance, protection, and just enough manpower to shout predators away. A single human with a stick. Snack. 20 humans with sticks and a fire. Problematic snack. The evidence is there in the archaeology. Sites with multiple hearths, tool scatterings, bones processed together. Humans weren't lone wanderers. They were cluster animals, forming circles in the grass, camps on the high ground, groups that could hurl stones and spears with something resembling teamwork. Because when lions tested the edges, what mattered wasn't one hero standing tall. It was a dozen people yelling, waving fire, throwing rocks until the predators decided antelope were easier. Of course, group living came with its own price. More mouths to feed, more fights over scraps, more crying babies to attract unwanted attention. And don't imagine idyllic cooperation either. It was tense, fragile, stitched together by the shared fear of teeth in the dark. But fear has always been the best glue. You didn't need to like each other. You just needed to not die. And let's not romanticize the heroics. Plenty of times, groups failed. Predators broke through, dragged someone screaming into the grass, and the rest had to sit, stunned, knowing there was nothing they could do. But statistically, the group fared better than the solitary. Even lions hesitate when a dozen angry bipeds throw rocks like toddlers at a birthday party, piñata. So picture yourself in that circle. The fire flickers low, everyone's pressed close, shoulders touching, breaths shared. Eyes scan the perimeter in shifts, ears twitch at every rustle. No one's pretending to be fearless. No one's imagining they're apex hunters. They're just hoping the group illusion holds long enough for dawn. Because in prehistory, safety wasn't found in strength. It was borrowed from numbers. You probably think insomnia is a modern curse, a side effect of glowing screens and too much caffeine. But no restless nights were baked into your species from the start. Because in the Pleistocene, someone always had to be awake. Night wasn't downtime, it was a shift. Picture your group huddled around a fading fire. The children are finally quiet, the old ones drifting into shallow dreams. And then it's your turn. Someone nudges you awake, mutters something like, "Don't let it go out." And suddenly you're the thin line between survival and silence. Eyes gritty, heart racing, ears straining into the dark. That's Night Watch, the original unpaid internship, with benefits that included maybe not getting eaten. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherers, like the Hadza in Tanzania, noticed something fascinating. Not everyone sleeps at once. Even in groups of 20 or 30, at least one person is awake almost all night. This isn't a modern quirk, it's ancient strategy. Segmented sleep, they call it. Evolution's way of saying, congratulations, you'll never fully rest again. Because predators didn't clock out when the sun set. Lions hunted mostly at night. Hyenas prowled with their eerie laughter. Leopards slipped silently through shadows. If your entire group drifted into deep sleep, odds were good you'd wake up to screams, if you woke at all. So instead, your people lived in a perpetual cycle of half-sleep, half-guard, forever teetering between exhaustion and vigilance. Imagine the toll it took. You, shivering in the cold, staring into blackness, every rustle amplified, every flicker of shadow a threat. Your heartbeat never slowed, your eyelids never stayed down for long. And yet this very anxiety, this sleeplessness, is why your line continued. Those who slept too deeply didn't pass on their genes. The paranoid, the insomniacs, the ones who startled at twigs snapping, they survived. Which is why you still flinch when your neighbor's cat knocks something over at 3 a.m. And the fire, always the fire. Keeping it alive was part of the duty. Feed it would blow on embers. Pray it didn't sputter out. Because once the flames died, the circle of safety shrank to nothing. And the glowing eyes, waiting just beyond the line of light, were suddenly much closer. Vigilance wasn't optional, it was currency. So when you complain today about not getting your 8 hours, remember, your ancestors never did either. Their nights were fragments, a mosaic of dozing and startling awake, punctuated by stints of staring into the void while predators breathed just out of sight. Night watch wasn't a choice. It was the tax you paid for seeing the sunrise. Fear, it turns out, is the reason you're still here. Not courage, not bravery, not some noble human spirit. Fear, the bone-deep, hair-raising, stomach-knotting kind that kept your ancestors alive long enough to pass the torch. You are, in the most literal sense, the descendants of the jumpiest people who ever lived. Think about it. The ones who heard a twig snap and thought, Probably the wind. Gone. The ones who bolted at every rustle, who panicked at shadows, who refused to wander alone, they survived. The hyperalert, the chronically anxious, the ones who assumed every noise was claws and teeth, they lived long enough to make more anxious children. Fear wasn't weakness, it was insurance. That startle reflex, you still have the one that makes you jolt when someone taps your shoulder unexpectedly. That's not a bug, that's an inheritance. Millennia of nights, spent knowing that one moment of inattention could end with jaws on your neck, wired your nervous system for alarm. You're basically a finely tuned panic machine, optimized by evolution to overreact. And fear didn't just keep individuals alive, it shaped the species. Humans who cooperated, who huddled together, who invented stories about spirits lurking in the dark. They weren't just creative, they were codifying vigilance into culture. Mythology wasn't entertainment, it was fear training. Every tale of glowing eyes, every warning about the woods at night, was a survival manual disguised as bedtime horror. Even your physiology owes a debt to fear. Sweaty palms, better grip when running or climbing, racing heartbeat, preloaded oxygen for sprinting away, big whites of the eyes, perfect for catching faint movement in the dark. You are, at the most basic biological level, a creature fine-tuned by the terror of being eaten, and fear never left. It lives in your bones, echoes in your instincts. The way you avoid dark alleys, the way you shiver at the thought of something watching from the tree line, the way children cling tighter when the lights go out. These aren't irrational quirks, they're ancient alarms, passed down like heirlooms, reminders that once upon a time, caution wasn't neurotic, it was necessary. So when you laugh at yourself for jumping at shadows or feeling uneasy in the woods, remember, that's the exact paranoia that let your ancestors dodge saber-tooths and hyenas. Fear sculpted your lineage, carved your reflexes, and whispered in your DNA. Better a false alarm than no alarm at all, because in prehistory, bravery was overrated. Fear was survival. And it's still in you, twitching under your skin, ready to jolt you awake at the faintest noise, the echo of predators your ancestors never stopped hearing. If you ever doubt that humans spent a very long time as prey, the fossils are there to shut you up. Bones don't lie. They hold the receipts, puncture marks, claw scratches, shattered skulls, the silent testimony of a species that was chewed on before it ever learned to chew back. Take the South African caves. At sites like Swartkrans and Sterkfontein, archaeologists have found early hominin bones with neat, circular punctures in the skulls, too precise to be random, perfect fit for leopard canines, which means some of your ancestors didn't just wander into caves for shelter, they were dragged there, dead or dying. As takeout, Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania tells a similar story. There, human bones bear the distinctive stamps of crocodile teeth. Deep, conical holes pressed into bone, the signature of jaws that closed fast and didn't let go. It's not interpretation, it's evidence, fossilized proof that rivers were as deadly as savanna grass. And it wasn't just the big-ticket predators. Hyena dens across Africa and Europe are littered with hominin remains, gnawed down, bones cracked open for marrow. In some cases, the amount of human bone mixed with animal bones suggests people weren't occasional victims, they were regular entrees. Your ancestors weren't dominating the landscape, they were padding someone else's pantry. The sheer volume of these remains paints a grim picture. Humans weren't apex predators for most of their history. They were opportunists, scraping survival on the margins, forever hunted by creatures faster, stronger, and better equipped. We like to remember the mammoth hunts, the triumphant spears, the cave paintings, but the archaeological record reminds us, for every glorious hunt, there were 10 nights when someone didn't come back. Their bones later found with tooth marks, and perhaps the most humbling detail, predators didn't bother to distinguish us from anything else. To a lion or a saber-tooth, you weren't special. You weren't the clever species destined for rockets and smartphones. You were just meat with slightly longer legs. The fossils prove it. Your ancestors were prey before they were anything else, and they left the evidence behind in broken ribs and punctured skulls. So when you stand in a museum staring at a cracked femur behind glass, know what you're looking at. Not just an ancient bone, but a survival story that almost didn't happen. The only reason you exist is because enough of your ancestors dodged the claws, slipped past the jaws, and handed their scars down the line. The fossils are the grim ledger of those who didn't. At night, the first wall was always made of fire. Not the polite kind that sits in a living room fireplace, but the sort that spits resin, coughs, sparks, and throws smoke like a wounded beast. Archaeologists have found scorched stone circles at cave mouths older than most have recorded. History marks of humans dragging their warmth to the very threshold of the dark. Fire wasn't only about staying warm, though warmth was no small mercy. It was about presence, a trembling line of flame between fragile bodies and the endless appetite of the night. Predators read light as danger. Eyeshine in the shadows often blinked once and disappeared when a log snapped into flame. It is telling that even today, in parts of East Africa, thorny enclosures and campfires are paired together against lions and hyenas. The technique is ancient torches kept near at hand, embers carefully fed until morning. Children grew up knowing that if the fire died, the night grew teeth. Some groups arranged fires in multiple small clusters rather than a single bonfire, a subtle trick of geometry that made the camp seem larger, more dangerous, and harder to circle. In essence, fire was theater, glowing eyes watching the dark, even as the dark watched back. But the trouble with theater is that it always needs props, and flames alone didn't satisfy the paranoia. Fire crackled, but predators learned patience. That's when people began layering defenses in other ways, laying down barriers that scratched, tore, and discouraged. Thorns made a wall where stone and wood failed. Not the grand ramparts of castles, but mean, scratchy barricades that ripped skin and fur with equal indifference. Imagine a ring of acacia branches, their hooked spines pointing outward, woven tight enough that a lion's snout thought twice before pressing through. Archaeological traces are slippery. Here plants don't fossilize into tidy evidence. But the logic is still alive in the practices of pastoralists today. The Maasai call them bomas, a circular stockade of thorn branches to pen cattle and children together. The family inside, the wilderness firmly outside. Early tribes didn't have neatly fenced corrals. They had improvisation, fallen trees dragged across camp edges, brush stacked in frantic lines, sharpened stakes half hidden in the soil. It wasn't elegant, but predators understood pain. A hyena that tested the edge of such a wall often left with a bloody muzzle, discouraged enough to try elsewhere. These enclosures also served another purpose. They shrank the night. Inside, the circle of firelight pressed against the woven branches, and everything beyond was reduced to rumor. Still, barriers and fire couldn't keep eyelids from growing heavy. Fatigue was another kind of predator, and no one trusted a camp where every head nodded off at once, which is why the next defense wasn't made of wood or flame, but of human eyes that had to stay open long after the body begged to sleep. The night watch was the oldest unpaid job in history. Someone had to sit by the embers, ears straining at every shift of wind, eyes watering from smoke, knowing that the others snored because they were awake. Evidence from hunter-gatherer camps suggests this practice wasn't occasional. It was a system. Groups staggered sleep so that at almost any given moment, one pair of eyes scanned the dark. Anthropologists studying modern foraging peoples, like the Hadza in Tanzania, found something remarkable. Even without planning, their sleeping patterns formed a natural net of vigilance. Somebody was always awake, and predators never had the gift of total surprise. But the role wasn't noble, it was terrifying. The watch sat with stones in hand, ready to clap them together, or with a hollow log that doubled as a drum. A simple sound was enough to wake the camp, to transform sleepers into a wall of voices and flame. The sentinel's imagination worked overtime. Every crack in the brush was a leopard, every whisper of grass a hyena circling closer. Sleep was sacrificed so the rest could risk dreaming, and when the shadows pressed too near, noise itself became the weapon. Not words of reason, but blunt, chaotic sounds that startled and confused. That leads, of course, to the strange way early people learned that volume could be deadlier than teeth. Sound was the cheapest spear anyone could carry. When shadows prowled too close to the camp, people turned the night into an orchestra of panic. Stones clapped, sticks drummed against hollow logs, voices rose in harsh rhythm. Predators wired to measure silence, to stalk the stillness before a kill was suddenly blinded by noise. Hyenas skulked away, ears pinned back. Lions hesitated at the racket of a dozen humans pretending to be an army. Anthropologists trace this habit into ritual. The same gestures that scared off animals became the backbone of ceremonies. Stamping feet, rattling bones, chanting until dawn. A defense mechanism evolved into culture, half practical, half mystical. The drumbeat wasn't just a warning to predators. It became a warning to spirits, enemies, even bad luck itself. In the flickering light, the line between survival strategy and performance blurred completely. Still, noise could only go so far. Eventually the fire burned low, throats went raw, and the predators learned patience again. Something else was needed, not louder shouts, but subtler tricks, a way to vanish into the night rather than fight it. That's where the art of masking scent slipped into play. Ash was the first camouflage. Not the painted stripes of soldiers, but the cold grey residue rubbed onto skin until the human scent thinned, lost in smoke and earth. Predators hunt with their noses more than their eyes, and a body fresh with sweat or blood was like a torch in the dark. So people dulled themselves coated with clay, smeared with pungent herbs, or caked in mud from the riverbank. What looked like filth was in fact a shield. There are modern echoes. Hunters in the Kalahari rub crushed leaves onto their bodies. Siberian reindeer herders still mask the smell of human presence when they need to pass unseen. The trick was simple. If you couldn't fight the nose of the predator, you gave it something else to smell. Sometimes fires were fed with particular herbs to cloak the whole camp in a bitter haze, a makeshift perfume that drove off both insects and the larger, hungrier things. But masking scent had limits. The wind betrayed everything eventually. That's why the earliest companions weren't other humans, but sharp-eared shadows at the edge of the firelight, animals that turned from predator into partner. This is where the story of dogs begins, curled beside the flames, noses and growls guarding the silence. Dogs were the alarm clocks of prehistory, only far less forgiving. Long before they became household pets with squeaky toys, they were stationed at the threshold of the dark, half wild, half domesticated, always listening. Archaeological sites like Bonneberg in Germany, dating back more than 14,000 years, showed dog burials with human companions, proof that their role wasn't just functional, but sacred. They weren't tools, they were allies. The difference between sleep and sudden death. A dog's bark did what no drum or rattle could. It gave direction. Predators might ignore human noise, but the warning growl of another carnivore shifted the balance. Wolves, circling a camp, thought twice when their cousins, those tamed shadows by the fire, snapped and lunged. In many traditions, dogs became liminal figures, guardians at the boundary between safety and wilderness, between the living and the spirits. They smelled what humans could not, sensed movement that eyes missed, and anchored the night with their restless pacing. Yet even with fire, fences, watchers, and dogs, the earth itself wasn't safe. Some nights the predators didn't come in snarling. They came in climbing or crawling beneath, which is why people learned to rise above it all, carrying their fragile bodies upward, away from the reach of claws and teeth. That leads into the strange architecture of elevated sleep. High ground was the most primitive form of architecture. Long before ladders led to barns and haylofts, people lashed branches into crude platforms, or claimed niches in cliffs to sleep above the teeth of the earth. In dense forests, raised beds of woven reeds kept bodies out of reach from snakes and prowling cats. In savanna landscapes, tree forks became precarious cradles. It wasn't comfortable. Mosquitoes hummed freely, and rolling over in sleep risked a fall, but it was better than waking up in a lion's mouth. Archaeologists have found traces of ancient bedding at sites like Border Cave in South Africa, layers of grasses laid carefully on raised surfaces, with insect-repelling ash dusted underneath. These weren't just mattresses. They were miniature fortresses, insulating sleepers from both predators and parasites. The logic was simple. Predators owned the ground, but they hesitate with heights. Humans, too fragile to run, learned instead to climb. But height and distance only solved part of the riddle. Predators could be avoided, yes, but could they be frightened? That's when early people began planting symbols, skulls, bones, carved figures that didn't just block bodies, but unsettled spirits. The perimeter became not just a wall, but a warning. Around the edge of the camp, bones grinned where no mouths should be. Skulls of antelope, horns of cattle, even the twisted jaw of a predator, unlucky enough to be killed. These were placed at the borders like grotesque signposts. To a lion, perhaps they were meaningless. To humans, they were charged with menace, infused with the hope that symbols could terrify as effectively as spears. The line between practical deterrent and ritual magic blurred. A pile of bones might clatter in the wind. A carved mask might catch firelight and leer back into the dark. Anthropologists note parallels in many early societies: fetishes planted at thresholds, charms nailed to doors, grotesque effigies hung on trees. Sometimes they worked not by frightening animals, but by unnerving the humans themselves into vigilance. A child who saw a skull leering at camp's edge would not wander into the dark. Predators may not have understood the message, but humans did. The night was dangerous, and the perimeter held its own guardians. And yet, bones alone were silent. To truly thicken the air, people turned to their voices, their breath, their endless supply of sound. The camp at night became not only a barricade of fire and thorn, but a chorus, the strange music of survival. The night was never quiet, not really. Even when the predators hung back, the humans filled the silence with stories. Around the fire, voices rose not in soft whispers meant to soothe, but in deliberate volume, carrying into the dark. Myths about lions with human faces, or hyenas that stole children, weren't just entertainment. They were warnings broadcast to anything listening. The rhythm of speech, the swell of chant, the sudden laughter or gasp, it all added to the illusion that the camp was larger, louder, harder to approach. Anthropologists studying oral traditions note how many origin tales and cautionary myths are anchored in the night. When the group gathered closest, predators, if they lingered, heard a wall of sound and saw shadows dancing on stone, movements too unpredictable to risk. In this way, stories became a kind of armor, their repetition both keeping people awake and projecting human presence into the dark. A song, half sung and half shouted, carried farther than the firelight, stitching together imagination and defense. But there were nights when noise and fire weren't enough, when the eyes glowed just beyond reach, refusing to yield. And in those moments, people didn't merely fight animals. They fought what the animals represented: forces larger, hungrier, more supernatural than teeth and claws. The night itself became a battleground, not of spears, but of spirits. Night was never just darkness. It was a theater of spirits. Predators were not only animals stalking the edges of the firelight, but emissaries of something larger: omens, curses, restless ancestors that wore fur and claws as masks. So people met them not only with torches and rattles, but with ritual. A shaman might smear ash across his face, mutter words shaped more like growls than language, and throw sparks into the night, as if bargaining with the unseen. Protection wasn't only physical. It was negotiated in trance, in song, in offerings tossed beyond the safety of the circle. Evidence of this survives in strange artifacts: amulets buried at thresholds, ochre smeared on cave walls near animal figures, carved talismans placed where fire once burned. These gestures weren't practical in the way fences or dogs were, but they gave meaning to the nightly battle. Hyenas at the camp's edge weren't just hungry, they were tests, incarnations of chaos trying to seep inside. By drumming, by chanting, by feeding the fire herbs that cracked and sparked like spells, tribes framed their fear as a ritual war. And so the defenses of early people were never just material. They were layered, half pragmatic, half mythic. A fence of thorns, a dog's bark, a line of skulls, a song, a whispered prayer. They stacked one atop the other until dawn finally arrived, the only real victory. Long before religions carved their gods into stone, fear itself did the carving. Out in the savannah, the jungle, the endless dark of the night. It wasn't philosophy that explained why people huddled together around the fire, but the shadow of teeth glinting just beyond the flames. Lions, crocodiles, serpents, wolves, creatures that could end a body in a heartbeat, were too powerful to be thought of as mere animals. They weren't just beasts, they were thresholds. To encounter them was to brush against something bigger, something with more weight than any human frame could carry. The natural conclusion, whispered from one frightened generation to the next, was that these killers must contain spirits inside them, spirits that demanded respect, fear, and offerings, if only to keep the teeth at bay. It wasn't an illogical leap. A man might kill another man, but it'd need tools, planning, perhaps a grudge. An animal, on the other hand, could do it without preparation, without hesitation, and with an elegance that bordered on ritual. The swiftness of a snake's strike, the crushing patience of a crocodile, it looked less like biology and more like intention. Death was too precise, too confident, to be the work of a soulless thing. And so fear became reverence. It became the first altar, not carved stone or towering temples, but the pounding heart of a hunter who realized the forest was already full of spirits and none of them were friendly. Of course, this reverence had its uses. It justified caution, it explained disasters, and it taught boundaries. Fear of the predator was also fear of the unknown, of the spaces where human law dissolved and the wild ruled with its own logic. And in that respect, the spirit inside the animal wasn't just the hunter of men, it was the guardian of everything beyond the edge of the firelight. If the spirit inside the animal was born of fear, then the landscape itself became its cathedral. Predators weren't everywhere. They were stationed like gatekeepers in specific thresholds. Rivers with crocodiles, deserts with serpents, forests where the night sang with feline growls. Each boundary had its keeper. Crossing wasn't just a matter of terrain, it was a matter of permission. To walk into lion country was to trespass on the territory of the lion's spirit, a sovereign ruler who demanded acknowledgement. This way of thinking wasn't superstition piled randomly on top of survival. It was a system. The crocodile that slid soundlessly beneath the river wasn't only a reptile, spirit was the toll collector between one bank and the other. The jaguar in the canopy wasn't just waiting for prey, it was the law of the jungle itself, enforcing silence and humility in those who dared enter. Boundaries weren't marked with fences or stones, but with roars and tracks and the bones of the careless. The spirits were the enforcers, shaping where humans built homes, where they dared to fish, where they prayed before entering. It was also practical theology. If every border is guarded by something that can kill, then survival requires negotiation. Offerings, chants, dances, stories, little bargains whispered into the night. And those bargains reinforced the idea that the animal wasn't merely animal. It was a bureaucrat of the wilderness, stamping your passport with its teeth. To survive its territory was to prove worthiness. To die was to confirm that the spirit had judged otherwise. And so the predator became less of a random terror and more of a necessary figure in the map of existence. To live within the boundaries of its spirit was order. To ignore them was chaos. That gaze from the edge of the forest, from the waterline, from the unlit horizon, it wasn't just menace. It was the reminder that there are always watchers, always guardians, always spirits waiting to decide what passes and what doesn't. There is something about being stared at by an animal that feels wrong, almost indecent. Not the casual glance of a grazing goat or the skittish look of a deer, but the fixed, patient gaze of a predator. Eyes that don't just look, they measure. People long ago understood that look as more than biology. To be caught in the gaze of a leopard or the unblinking eyes of an owl at midnight was to be drawn into a transaction you hadn't agreed to. Your soul, they thought, wasn't a sealed box. It was porous, slippery, capable of leaking or being stolen through the eyes. And animals, with their strange, steady watching, were experts at taking it. The belief had teeth in it because it matched experience. Hunters spoke of locking eyes with wolves and feeling themselves shrink, as if part of them had already been claimed. Even today, there's unease in staring contests with creatures that cannot explain themselves. Folklore grew fat on that unease. The basilisk whose gaze killed outright. The snake that hypnotized victims into paralysis. The raven whose look predicted death. To meet such eyes wasn't chance, it was contact with the spirit inside, demanding recognition, and so people shielded themselves. Shimones painted eyelids with ash to break the line of sight. Mothers tied charms over a baby's face, lest a bird or a cat steal the child's breath through a glance. In some traditions, mirrors were placed near beds not to admire oneself, but to confuse the spirits that entered through watching eyes. The predator's gaze wasn't only physical danger, was metaphysical theft, the silent plucking of a soul unguarded. The irony is that this fear didn't diminish the predator, it elevated it. An animal that could take life with its claws was already dangerous, but one that could seize the essence of a person without moving. That was the work of a spirit, not flesh. And once the gaze had taken hold, there seemed only one way to balance the scales, to claim something back from the animal itself. Once the animal's gaze was thought capable of stealing the soul, the obvious question arose, could the human not steal something back? Death, after all, wasn't just an end, it was an exchange. If the lion devoured a man, surely the man's spirit lodged itself inside the lion, strengthening the beast. And if a hunter brought down the lion, then some of the lion's power slipped into him. This was the rough arithmetic of early spirituality. Fear could be balanced, borrowed, even inverted, so long as one was willing to risk the transaction. It explained the obsession with wearing parts of predators' claws strung on leather cords, teeth carved into amulets, pelts draped across shoulders. These weren't trophies in the modern sense of ego. They were insurance policies, symbols of absorbed spirit. To wear the skin of a bear wasn't merely warmth, it was proximity to the bear's essence, a way to intimidate others, and, more importantly, to assure oneself that the animal's terrifying strength had not been wasted but recycled. Rituals amplified this logic. Some peoples believed eating the heart of a wolf or drinking the blood of a jaguar allowed its spirit to seep into the body, rewiring courage, sharpening senses, strengthening resolve. Anthropologists, ever sober in their language, call it sympathetic magic. But for those who performed it, it was not metaphor, it was ingestion of raw power. The spirit inside the feared animal didn't vanish when the beast died. It lingered in bone, fur, blood, waiting to be claimed. Of course, this exchange was risky. If the animal's spirit was too strong, it could corrupt rather than empower, dragging the hunter into madness or bad luck. But perhaps that risk was the point. To take power was always dangerous, and only those willing to gamble with spirits deserved to wield it. And when gambling with spirits, nothing was ever simple, because not every feared creature was straightforwardly strong. Some were dangerous precisely because they were slippery, unpredictable, and hard to pin down. Not all feared animals roared with authority or crushed with brute force. Some unsettled people for the opposite reason. They slithered between categories, refusing to be one thing or another. Hyenas with their broken laughter, foxes that vanished just when you thought you had them cornered, crows that watched from rooftops as if waiting for the punchline of some private joke. These weren't predators that ruled borders like lions or crocodiles. They were troublemakers, reminding humans that not all spirits played by the same rules. The fear here wasn't about raw power, but about uncertainty. A hyena could tear flesh, yes, but its eerie giggle was worse. It sounded like a parody of human laughter, as if mocking the living before they were even dead. Foxes, meanwhile, prowled the edge of settlements, slipping into chicken coops like burglars, leaving just enough chaos to prove their point. And crows, clever and unhurried, seemed less like scavengers than bureaucrats of death, filing away scraps of the departed with meticulous efficiency. To live alongside these animals was to feel constantly subtle, constantly toyed with, as though their spirits were less guardians and more comedians with knives. Cultures did the only sensible thing. They made them into characters. Folktales are littered with these beasts' aspirates, always tricking hunters, seducing the unwary, flipping power upside down. They explained the world's unfairness, why wealth vanished overnight, why fools sometimes triumphed, why the supposedly wise were embarrassed in public. The spirit of the trickster animal carried that chaos in its belly, and perhaps that's why people feared them so much. A lion may kill you cleanly, a crow may ruin your life slowly, laughing all the while. It's a different kind of reverence, the respect you give not to a tyrant but to a jester who knows all your secrets. Yet even those spirits had their place. They proved that survival wasn't only about strength. It was about cunning, mischief, the ability to slip between lines without being caught. And if some animals mocked humanity, others went further still. They escorted it across the final boundary. For all their teeth and claws, predators were rarely imagined as mere killers. They were couriers, to be taken by a jaguar in the jungle, a shark in the reef, or a vulture circling above was not simply a violent end. It was a delivery. Death by animal meant the spirit inside the beast had claimed the victim, lifted them or dragged them across the invisible threshold between this life and whatever waited beyond. The animal wasn't a murderer, it was a sctopomp. This logic wove itself into myth. The Norse whispered of wolves that swallowed the sun and moon, escorting light itself to the underworld. Steppe peoples saw the eagle not just as a hunter, but as a transporter of souls, carrying them skyward in its talons. Even the scavengers, the hyena, the vulture, were thought less as desecrators of corpses than facilitators of passage. Sky burials in Central Asia and Tibet weren't designed to shock. They were designed to let the animal spirits do their work, consuming flesh to release the soul. The tearing of sinew was, paradoxically, an act of liberation. And so the presence of predators at the edge of death wasn't always dreaded. Sometimes it was expected, even welcomed. To be devoured was to be escorted properly. The spirit inside the animal was not only stronger than human life, it was also better connected to whatever lay waiting. In a world where funerals could fail, where rituals could go wrong, the certainty of an animal's appetite provided a kind of brutal reliability. No one ever doubted that a vulture would do its job. It gave the animal a strange dual role: executioner and priest, destroyer and ferryman. But no ferryman works for free, and people, never content with being passive passengers, sought ways to negotiate, to prepay, to bribe these spirits with offerings and clever substitutions so that death might be delayed, redirected, or at least bargained into something less terrifying. If the animal could act as executioner and ferryman, then surely it could also be persuaded, if not to spare entirely, then at least to postpone. And so, everywhere people lived under the gaze of teeth and talons, they invented little negotiations. Offerings at the riverbank for crocodiles, a goat, a chicken, sometimes just a bowl of grain, cast into the water so the spirit inside the reptile would stay satisfied with that, instead of a fisherman. In forests thick with big cats, hunters left meat on tree stumps as a kind of toll-fi, a quiet recognition that the jaguar's spirit controlled the night trails. Masks, too, belonged to this economy of fear. A man painted with stripes or cloaked in fur might walk into a ritual circle, not to mock the predator but to trick it, to say, "Look, I am one of you, don't bother." The same logic turned up in charms sewn onto children's clothing, tiny claws, teeth, or tufts of fur pinned as if to convince prowling spirits. Nothing worth taking here, only kin. It was the ancient equivalent of placing a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door, though the consequences of ignoring it were rather more final. Sometimes the substitutions became elaborate. In parts of Africa and Asia, people sacrificed animals to animal spirits, a goat to stand in for a human life, blood for blood. The offering wasn't symbolic, it was an actual transaction, a way of saying, "We've paid the toll, leave us alone." Even dancers carried this weight. Whole communities would imitate the predator's movements, circling, snarling, clawing at the air, rehearsing fear as theater, so that the spirit might be fooled into thinking it had already collected its due. It was a practical strategy wrapped in sacred performance, and like all negotiations with power, it contained an element of deceit, substitution, disguise, mimicry. Yet the logic always circled back to the same one: if the predator could be tricked, it meant it could be mirrored, and if it could be mirrored, perhaps it could also be embodied, which led to the unsettling belief that some animals weren't just enemies or ferrymen, but double shadows of the people themselves. The line between human and animal was never as solid as later centuries pretended. In shamanic visions, in fever dreams, in the quiet hours of the night, people saw their own reflections walking on four legs, feathered, furred, scaled. The predator wasn't just out there, it was in here, waiting to be recognized. To dream of a wolf was to see one's other self. To be haunted by a jaguar in trance was to discover the animal spirit that shadowed a person's life. Doppelgangers weren't imagined as quaint metaphors. They were living, breathing doubles, stalking alongside, and sometimes taking over. This wasn't simply animism for decoration. It shaped identity. A child might be said to carry the soul of an eagle, a hunter the double of a bear. Shamans, of course, went further, deliberately merging with their animal counterparts, in ritual cloaking themselves in fur, smearing on blood, howling until their throats shredded, to show that they and their doubles had fused. In such states, the human body became porous, the boundary thinned. If the animal spirit could slip into a human frame, then perhaps the human spirit could slip back out, finding safety in claws and wings. And there were dangers here. If someone's double was seen too often, say, a fox appearing near the village whenever a certain man was absent, it bred suspicion. Was he human at all? Was he walking among neighbors in disguise? Whole layers of witchcraft accusations bloomed from this unease. To harm the animal might harm the human. To kill one was to kill the other. The doppelganger belief turned every predator into a possible relative, and every relative into a possible predator. The logic held tight because it explained the uncanny. Those moments when a gaze from the underbrush felt to knowing, when a howl in the night echoed too much like a neighbor's voice. The animal spirit wasn't just companion or adversary. It was the shadow self, lurking, unpredictable, capable of stepping forward when least expected. And once shadows began to speak, They spoke not in silence but in sounds, so haunting that they could only belong to spirits themselves. Few things stitched fear and reverence together more tightly than the sounds predators made. A roar at night, carrying for miles across a savanna, wasn't heard as mere vibration of air. It was speech, a declaration from the spirit world. The low rumble of a jaguar, the shrill scream of a hunting owl, the broken giggle of a hyena, these were not treated as noises but as messages. When the forest spoke in growls, the interpretation was simple. The spirits were awake, and they had opinions. Communities tried to answer back. Hunters imitated wolf howls or bird calls, not only to trick prey but to converse with the animal spirits. Shamans built whole ceremonies around these mimicries, their throats rattling like snakes, their chants pitched to echo owls in the dark. It was a dialogue, one that recognized the predator's voice as older, more authoritative, and more dangerous than human speech. Even thunder was sometimes explained as the echo of an animal's raw spirits shaking the sky, with voices too big for earth. What unsettled people most was how much those sounds resembled them. A hyena's laughter, distorted yet familiar, was unnerving precisely because it blurred the line between human mirth and animal menace. The echo of wolves across valleys sounded like choirs, like lamentations, too close to human grief to be dismissed as coincidence. In those eerie resemblances, people heard confirmation. Spirits weren't just inside the animals, they were trying to speak through them. And so every sound carried weight. To hear a crow call 3 times at dawn might be a warning. To hear an owl screech above a roof meant illness was circling. Silence itself, in predator-haunted landscapes, became suspicious, as if the spirits had simply paused their conversation to listen in. The voice of the animal was thus the voice of judgment. Verdicts barked, hissed, or screamed across the night. And once voices became divine, there was only one step left: to stop treating these creatures as mere vessels, and to start treating them as gods outright. Fear has a way of fossilizing into ritual, and over centuries the spirits inside animals stopped being merely dangerous companions of the wilderness. They became gods. Crocodiles lounging in the Nile's muddy currents weren't just predators to Egyptians. They were avatars of Sobek, whose temples rose beside the very waters he ruled. Jaguars that once stalked villages in Mesoamerica ascended to thrones, worshipped as embodiments of night, war, and kingship. Snakes, those tireless symbols of death and rebirth, slithered into divine status from India to the Mediterranean, curling through myths as creators, destroyers, or both. This was the final twist of the old logic. The more terrifying the animal, the more sacred it became. Worship wasn't separate from fear. It was fear crystallized into form, given names, temples, festivals, masks. To pray to a crocodile god was simply to formalize what people already felt at the riverbank. To dance in jaguar pelts before a temple was to bow publicly to the spirit everyone already knew lurked in the jungle shadows. The ritual was not invention, but acknowledgement. The state's way of codifying the truth, whispered around campfires. These beasts are more powerful than us, and therefore they must be divine. And once divinity took hold, fear turned almost tender. A god could protect as well as destroy, bless as well as punish. The spirits of the animals became patrons, guides, ancestors, capricious ones. Yes, but indispensable. Human lives bent around their cycles, the times to fish or farm, the seasons to hunt or abstain, the moments to mourn or celebrate. In honoring them, people weren't simply appeasing predators, they were weaving survival into cosmology. In the end, the animals humans feared most became the very backbone of their mythologies. The line between beast, spirit, and god dissolved, leaving only reverence carved into stone and sung in ritual. Fear had not only explained the world, it had built the temples, and in those temples, the echoes of roars, hisses, and wings still lingered, not as threats, but as prayers.